On May 26, 2025, the city of Liverpool was celebrating. Hundreds of thousands of fans packed the streets for their beloved football club's Premier League title victory parade. Families with young children. Elderly supporters who'd waited decades for this moment. Students, workers, tourists. All united in joy along Water Street in the heart of the city. But in just 45 seconds, that celebration would transform into absolute carnage. 134 people injured, 50 hospitalized, a 6-month-old baby thrown from his pram, a 77-year-old woman trapped beneath 2 tons of metal, an 11-year-old boy fighting for his life. And the man responsible? Not a terrorist, not a radicalized extremist, not even a career criminal. He was a 54-year-old father of 3, a former Royal Marine, a man who organized neighborhood street parties and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. This is the story of how ordinary rage became extraordinary violence. This is the story of Paul Doyle and the 45 seconds that destroyed hundreds of lives. I'm your host, and this is the Liverpool Parade Horror. To understand what happened on Water Street, we need to understand the city of Liverpool on May 26, 2025. Liverpool is a city that lives and breathes football. For decades, Liverpool FC had dominated English football, but the Premier League title, the big one, had proven elusive in recent years. So when the team clinched the championship in late May 2025, the city exploded in celebration. The victory parade was scheduled for late afternoon, running through the city center from the Albert Dock, along the Strand, up Water Street, and through to Castle Street. The route would pass some of Liverpool's most iconic locations: the historic waterfront, the business district, the cultural quarter. By 2 p.m., crowds were already gathering. Families staked out prime viewing spots. Pubs overflowed onto the streets. The atmosphere was electric. Among the hundreds of thousands in attendance were people like Teddy Eve's son, just 6 months old, nestled safely in his pram as his parents pushed through the crowd to get a better view. There was an unnamed 77-year-old woman, a lifelong Liverpool supporter who'd traveled into the city specifically for this moment, and an 11-year-old boy attending with his father, experiencing what should have been a core memory of pure childhood joy. But 8 miles away, in the quiet residential area of West Derby, Paul Doyle was having a very different kind of day. Paul Desmond Sanders Doyle was 54 years old. He lived with his wife in the West Derby area, on the northern edge of Liverpool. They had 3 grown children. To his neighbors, Paul was the epitome of a good community man. He was a fitness enthusiast, regularly participating in triathlons. He'd served in the Royal Marines earlier in life, a point of pride for him. He had no significant criminal history, no violence, no concerning behavior. He was by all accounts ordinary, perhaps too ordinary. Because what we're about to discover is that ordinariness can be a mask. And beneath Paul Doyle's friendly exterior was something dark, waiting for the right trigger. At approximately 5:45 p.m. to 17:45 in military time, Paul Doyle left his home. According to his later statements to police, he was driving into the city center to collect a friend. Now, anyone familiar with Liverpool would have known that the city center was essentially locked down for the parade. Roads were closed. Diversions were in place. The Merseyside police had published detailed maps of the closures days in advance. But Paul Doyle either didn't check these closures or, more troublingly, didn't care. His vehicle was a silver Ford Galaxy Titanium, a large multi-purpose vehicle, essentially a minivan. The kind of car you'd see dropping kids at school. Completely unremarkable. As he drove closer to the city center, he began encountering the first road closures near the Strand and Water Street. This was approximately 5:55 p.m., and this is where things began to unravel. Dashcam footage, which would later prove absolutely crucial to the investigation, shows Doyle's growing agitation. He's stuck in traffic, surrounded by celebrating fans in red shirts, scarves, and face paint. You can see him gripping the steering wheel, shaking his head, and then he begins shouting. The audio captured him swearing at pedestrians, yelling at traffic marshals who were trying to manage the diversions. His face, clearly visible in the dashcam's interior camera, shows pure frustration morphing into rage. For most people, this would have been an annoying inconvenience. You'd turn around, find a different route, maybe text your friend to meet elsewhere. You'd be frustrated, sure, but you'd move on. Paul Doyle made a different choice. At 6:03 p.m., an emergency ambulance activated its sirens to pass through the crowded Water Street cordon. This is standard procedure. Emergency vehicles must be allowed through, even during major events. The crowd, hearing the sirens, parted respectfully to let the ambulance through. Traffic marshals temporarily lifted barriers, and Paul Doyle saw his opportunity. What happened in the next 45 seconds would change hundreds of lives forever. At 6:03:30, Paul Doyle aggressively maneuvered his silver Ford Galaxy directly behind the ambulance. Witnesses described him essentially tailgating the emergency vehicle, using it as a battering ram to push through the crowd. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't panic. This was calculated opportunism. The ambulance passed through safely and continued on its emergency call. But Doyle didn't follow it away from the crowd. Instead, as the pedestrians began to reconverge behind the ambulance, filling the street again, Doyle accelerated. At 6:04 p.m. exactly, his vehicle surged forward into the densest part of the crowd. What I'm about to describe is based on police evidence, witness statements, and synchronized video footage. It's deeply disturbing. If you need to step away, please do so now. The Ford Galaxy traveled approximately 50 meters through the crowd at Water Street, near its junction with Dale Street. These GPS coordinates, 53 degrees, 24 minutes, 26.6 seconds north, 2 degrees, 59 minutes, 31.8 seconds west, would become the focal point of one of the largest criminal investigations in Merseyside police history. The vehicle struck people indiscriminately, young and old, men and women, children and infants. 6-month-old Teddy Eve's son was thrown from his pram. His parents watched in horror as their baby became airborne from the impact. The 77-year-old woman fell directly into the vehicle's path and became trapped underneath, suffering multiple fractures as 2 tons of metal crushed down on her body. The 11-year-old boy sustained catastrophic lower body injuries that would require months of reconstructive surgery. These were just 3 of 134 documented injuries. 50 people required hospitalization, some with life-changing trauma. The vehicle only stopped at 6:04:45, not because Paul Doyle hit the brakes, but because the car became mechanically obstructed. Bodies and debris had literally jammed the undercarriage. In the immediate aftermath, the scene on Water Street was described by first responders as like a war zone. People screaming for help, parents searching frantically for children, blood on the pavement, discarded shoes, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. And in the driver's seat of the Ford Galaxy, Paul Doyle sat motionless, still gripping the steering wheel. Within seconds, witnesses began converging on the vehicle, and their intent was not to check on the driver. Multiple witnesses later testified that they attempted to pull Doyle from the car, and their language made clear that they intended to deliver immediate justice. The mood was lynch mob dangerous. Merseyside police officers, already deployed heavily for the parade, reached the scene within 90 seconds. Their first action wasn't just to arrest Doyle. It was to protect him from the crowd. Officers formed a protective cordon around the vehicle as they extracted Doyle and placed him under arrest. He was described as compliant and silent, offering no resistance. He was immediately transported under heavy guard to a secure custody facility, while the street behind him descended into chaos as paramedics triaged the injured. By 6:30 p.m., the Merseyside police had activated their major incident protocol. Assistant Chief Constable Jenny Sims was appointed as the senior officer in charge of public messaging. Within hours, the question everyone was asking was this terrorism? Given the method, a vehicle deliberately driven into a crowd, the immediate assumption was that this was a terrorist attack, similar to the Nice attack in 2016 or the Berlin Christmas market attack. Counterterrorism Policing Northwest was deployed. But by the next morning, May 27th, ACC Jenny Sims held a press conference with a surprising announcement. This was not being treated as terrorism. Background checks on Paul Doyle showed no radicalization, no extremist connections, no manifesto, no political or religious motive. This wasn't ISIS. This wasn't far-right extremism. This was something far more unsettling. This was rage. Pure, unfiltered, catastrophic rage. The investigation into Paul Doyle would become one of the most complex criminal cases in UK history, not because of who he was, but because of the sheer scale of evidence. The Merseyside Police Major Crime Unit, under the oversight of ACC Jenny Sims and working closely with Chief Crown Prosecutor Sarah Hammond, faced an enormous challenge, proving that this wasn't an accident. Because that's exactly what Doyle's defense team would argue, that he panicked, that he was overwhelmed by the crowd, that he didn't mean to hurt anyone. He just wanted to escape. The prosecution needed to prove mens rea, the intent to harm, and they had exactly the evidence to do it. Within 48 hours of the incident, over 400 witness statements had been taken. But more importantly, Merseyside Police opened a public portal for video uploads. They received over 10,000 files, cell phone videos from every conceivable angle, crowd selfies that accidentally captured the vehicle approaching, security cameras from nearby businesses, even footage from drones that fans had been flying to capture the parade. The police used something called video stitching technology, a process where they synchronized all of these individual clips using timestamps and GPS metadata to create a complete 360-degree timeline of the vehicle's path. Think of it like recreating a moment in time from every possible perspective. They could see Doyle's vehicle from the front, the sides, behind, from above. They could track its speed, its trajectory, its every movement. But the most damning evidence came from Doyle's own car. The Ford Galaxy was equipped with a dash cam, a camera that records both the road ahead and the interior of the vehicle. These devices are common in the UK for insurance purposes. Paul Doyle probably installed it to protect himself from false accident claims. Instead, it became the smoking gun that destroyed his defense. The dash cam captured everything. His facial expressions as he encountered traffic, his growing agitation, his shouting at pedestrians and marshals. And most crucially, in the moments before he accelerated into the crowd, the audio recorded him shouting specific, angry expletives at Liverpool fans. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a medical episode. This wasn't confusion. This was fury. Modern vehicles are essentially computers on wheels. Every action is recorded by the Electronic Control Unit, or ECU, often called the black box. Forensic technicians extracted the ECU data from Doyle's Ford Galaxy, and what they found was chilling. During the 45 seconds of impact, the accelerator was depressed between 90 and 100%. Full throttle. There was no attempt to brake. None. The brake pedal wasn't touched until the very end, when the vehicle had already stopped moving due to mechanical obstruction. The defense team tried to argue mechanical failure. Maybe the brakes failed. Maybe the accelerator stuck. Forensic analysis conclusively ruled this out. The vehicle's brakes, steering, and throttle were all functioning perfectly. Paul Doyle accelerated deliberately. He maintained that acceleration through the crowd. And he only stopped because physics forced him to. There was one more test, toxicology. The results came back negative. No alcohol, no drugs, not even prescription medications that might impair judgment. Paul Doyle was stone cold sober. This removed any possible mitigation of intoxication. This wasn't drunken stupidity. This wasn't drug-fueled psychosis. This was a conscious, rational decision made by a clear-minded man who was simply too angry to care about human life. Paul Doyle was formally charged on May 29, 2025, initially with dangerous driving and wounding. But as medical assessments of the victims continued throughout the summer, the charges expanded dramatically. By August 2025, the indictment included 31 separate charges. 17 counts of attempted grievous bodily harm, with intent 9 counts of causing grievous bodily harm, with intent 3 counts of wounding, with intent plus dangerous driving and affray. Now, you might be wondering, why not attempted murder? This was actually a subject of significant legal debate. The Crown Prosecution Service, led by Sarah Hammond, made a tactical decision. To prove attempted murder, you must prove that the defendant specifically intended to kill specific individuals. With 134 victims, proving that Doyle wanted to kill each of them individually is legally complex. But attempted GBH with intent, grievous bodily harm, only requires proving he intended to cause really serious harm. With the dashcam evidence, the vehicle data, and the injury patterns, this was much easier to prove. And here's the key. Both charges carry the same maximum penalty under UK law: life imprisonment. So the CPS opted for the charge they were certain they could prove, while maintaining the same potential sentence. On September 4th, 2025, Paul Doyle appeared in court and entered his plea. Not guilty to all charges. His defense team, led by barrister Simon Soka KC, began building a defense around psychological overwhelm. They would argue that Doyle, confronted with an unexpected road closure and surrounded by an aggressive crowd, simply panicked. They'd bring in expert witnesses on crowd psychology, stress responses, the fight-or-flight mechanism. They'd paint Doyle as a frightened man who made a terrible split-second decision. But they had a problem. Actually, several problems. First, the route Doyle took showed deliberate circumvention of barriers. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was calculated navigation toward the crowd. Second, the timing. He waited specifically for the ambulance to create an opening. That required patience and planning, not panic. Third, the accelerator data. Panic would typically involve erratic pedal use, stomping on both brake and gas in confusion. Instead, Doyle maintained smooth, consistent acceleration. And fourth, most damning of all, the dashcam audio. You could hear him swearing at the fans, specifically targeting them with angry language, moments before he accelerated. Fear and panic don't sound like that. Rage does. The trial was scheduled to begin on November 25th, 2025, at Liverpool Crown Court. The presiding judge was Andrew Menery KC, the recorder of Liverpool, one of the most experienced judges in the region. The prosecution had prepared an overwhelming case. They had the dashcam footage queued up, frame by frame. They had the ECU data ready to present. They had medical experts prepared to testify about injury patterns. They had witnesses, dozens of them, ready to describe what they saw. But most importantly, they had something the defense didn't expect. They had audio of Paul Doyle's own voice, captured by his own camera, expressing pure rage at the people he was about to drive into. On November 25th, the jury was sworn in. Opening statements were scheduled for the next day. But on the morning of November 26th, day 2 of the trial, something extraordinary happened. Paul Doyle's legal team requested an emergency conference with the judge. When court reconvened, Simon Soka KC stood and announced that his client wished to change his plea. On all 31 counts, Paul Doyle pleaded guilty. The trial was over before it truly began. So what changed? Legal analysts suggest that once the defense team saw the full extent of the dashcam footage, particularly the synchronized audio and video showing Doyle's emotional state, they realized the case was unwinnable. A jury would watch that footage. They'd hear his voice. They'd see his face. And then they'd see the carnage that followed 45 seconds later. No amount of expert testimony about panic responses could overcome that. Additionally, under UK sentencing guidelines, a guilty plea, especially one entered before a full trial, can result in a reduced sentence. Not a massive reduction for crimes this serious, but perhaps the difference between a 30-year minimum and a 25-year minimum. For a 54-year-old man, that could mean the difference between dying in prison and potentially seeing freedom again in his late 70s or early 80s. But there's another possibility, one that's more cynical. Perhaps Paul Doyle's legal team advised him that forcing the victims, including the parents of 6-month-old Teddy, the 77-year-old woman, the 11-year-old boy, to testify and relive their trauma would only make the judge angrier at sentencing. A guilty plea could be seen as showing remorse, even if that remorse only appeared when conviction became inevitable. As of December 4th, 2025, today, Paul Doyle sits in custody awaiting sentencing, scheduled for December 15th and 16th. Judge Menery has already indicated that Doyle should expect a custodial sentence of some length. In legal terms, that's an understatement that signals life imprisonment with a substantial minimum term. But let's talk about the real aftermath. The people whose lives were destroyed on Water Street. Teddy Eve's son was 6 months old. He couldn't walk yet. He couldn't talk. He was just beginning to recognize his parents' faces and smile at them. When Doyle's vehicle struck his pram, Teddy was thrown several feet into the air. He sustained significant trauma. The specific injuries haven't been publicly disclosed to protect the family's privacy, but he was hospitalized and underwent multiple medical procedures. Teddy will never remember May 26, 2025, but his parents will never forget it. And doctors will monitor him for years to determine if there are any long-term developmental impacts from his injuries. The 77-year-old woman, whose name has also been withheld, suffered multiple fractures when she became trapped beneath the vehicle. Pelvis, ribs, legs, the kind of injuries that, for someone her age, may never fully heal. Even if the bones mend, the psychological trauma of being crushed under a car while a city celebrates around you, that doesn't heal. The 11-year-old boy underwent extensive reconstructive surgery on his lower body. He faces months, possibly years of physical therapy. He may walk with a permanent limp. He may never play sports again. He went to see his heroes celebrated, and instead, he became a victim of senseless violence. These are just 3 stories. There are 131 others. Some are physically unharmed, but will carry PTSD for the rest of their lives. Others sustained injuries that haven't made headlines, but will affect them daily: chronic pain, reduced mobility, scarring. And then there are the witnesses. The people who didn't get hit, but watched it happen. The parents who saw other children injured and imagined their own. The emergency responders who had to triage screaming victims in the middle of what should have been a celebration. May 26, 2025, was supposed to be one of the happiest days in Liverpool's history. Instead, it became a day of trauma for hundreds of families. There's an additional layer of betrayal in this case that often gets overlooked. Paul Doyle wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a random stranger. He was part of the Liverpool community. He lived in West Derby, a Liverpool neighborhood. His neighbors described him as helpful, friendly, community-minded. He organized street parties. He helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. Some of the people on Water Street that day might have lived near him, might have been his neighbors, might have smiled and waved to him at the local shops. And he drove through them without hesitation. This created a profound sense of disillusionment in the local community. If Paul Doyle, ex-Marine, family man, triathlon runner, good neighbor, could do this, then who could you trust? It's a question that doesn't have a good answer. So how do we make sense of this? The truth is we can't. Not really. There's no satisfying explanation for why a 54-year-old man with no history of violence, no criminal record, no warning signs, suddenly decided that his convenience was worth more than the lives and safety of 134 human beings. Maybe it was a lifetime of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. Maybe it was a narcissistic personality that simply couldn't tolerate being inconvenienced. Maybe it was something we'll never fully understand because Paul Doyle himself doesn't understand it. What we do know is this. On May 26, 2025, ordinary rage became extraordinary violence. And hundreds of people paid the price for one man's 45 seconds of fury. Paul Doyle will be sentenced on December 15th. He'll almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. But for his victims, there is no sentence that can undo what was done. Teddy will grow up with this as part of his medical history. The 77-year-old woman will carry these injuries into her final years. The 11-year-old boy will have scars that last a lifetime. As for Liverpool, the city has shown resilience. The community has rallied around the victims. Fundraisers have been organized. Counseling has been provided. The parade of 2025 will not define the city, but it will always be remembered. This has been the Liverpool Parade Horror. I'm your host. Thank you for watching, and please take care of each other out there, because sometimes the monsters don't come from the shadows. Sometimes they come from the house next door.